Hey guys, my name's Michael North and I'm the lead Roto paint artist at Luma Pictures in Melbourne. Some of my recent projects include Ant-Man 2, Captain Marvel, and Spider-Man Far From Home. The purpose of this tutorial series is to provide a window into what it's like to do Roto paint work on feature films, and to give you the knowledge and tools and confidence to prepare for work in the industry. I've specifically designed these tutorials to emulate the kind of work you'll be doing when you get that first job as a Roto paint artist. So if you're a student wanting to get into Roto paint or compositing, or if you've recently entered the industry and want to learn some new tools and workflows to improve your abilities, then this tutorial series is for you. Even if you're a beginner level in Nuke, you should be able to follow along just fine, but this tutorial does assume that you know your way around Nuke, at least a little bit. In this tutorial, we're going to be working on doing a paint patch for Iron Man's chest area. So we'll just quickly look at the original plate. That's what we're starting with. And then this is we'll end up with something like this. So firstly we're going to be looking at the method of how we're going to get to here, and then we're going to do it all again from scratch. So we'll be covering stuff like stabilizing, painting, grid warping, match moving, a bunch of other things. And then towards the end we're going to go over a few super important topics around plate fidelity, such as filtering, concatenation, sharpening artifacts, working in log. So if you're a Nuke artist of any variety, these are some of the things that should be part of your foundational knowledge. So this tutorial, I'll be putting a particular focus on plate fidelity, which is one of the most important aspects of doing paint work. And what I mean by fidelity is how well are we maintaining the details of the original plate. It's one of the common notes that you're likely to receive from your supervisor when you're starting out, that you're softening the plate or losing plate detail. And you're likely to keep getting these notes over and over again until you understand a few fundamental concepts and techniques to avoid losing plate detail and restoring plate details when we do soften the plate. So now that we've covered why these topics are important, let's have a look at what we're going to be doing. So the task, as I said, we're going to be patching in this area here. So we're going to be completing his reactor. We're going to be continuing this hexagonal shape upwards. And I'll just play through it again. So what's the best way to accomplish this task that we've been given? We're obviously going to need to do a painted patch and track it in. If we look at how much the lighting is changing over the course of the shot, I think we can say from the outset that it's going to be too much to ask a single patch to sort of cover the whole frame range here. So straight away you'll be thinking, this is going to be a task where we'll be dissolving between multiple patches. And that's exactly what I did. If we have a look at the setup that I've included here. So I'll quickly go through this setup and illustrate what I've done. And then we're actually going to go back and just redo this from scratch. So the first thing I did is I spent a bit of time getting a pretty good stabilization of his chest area here. This is not always the first step. Obviously eventually we're going to need to get a good match move of his chest to track in our patch, but there are certain advantages to working on a stabilized plate, and one of those you'll see later. It's going to make our lives a lot easier when we are using our grid warp workflow here to kind of refine the patch and sort of massage it into place, so we can get a really precise result. There's always different ways to approach a shot. I think for this shot, working on a stabilized plate is going to really help us. And just in general, I really like working on a stabilized plate and viewing things stabilized, just because it really highlights any issues that you have in your work when you take out all of that extra movement in the camera and movement in our character. And if you can get your paint working really well while viewing it and stabilized, it basically guarantees that it's going to just be rock solid once you actually match move it and put that movement back into the plate. So I stabilized the plate, and then we have our 3 frames here. These are the 3 frames that I chose to paint up on. We probably got away with 2, but I thought that extra patch would just, provide that extra bit more accuracy over certain frames. So on each of these frames, just stepping down, just kind of layering up the paint. Then we have our roto shape that's kind of isolating and pre-molting the part of the plate that is going to become our patch. And then I mentioned this grid warp earlier, and these grid warp nodes are here basically because our stabilization is never going to be 100%. So these grid warp nodes, they're basically our manual way to maneuver the patch so it's as closely matching the plate as possible. And so we're doing that for all 3 of our patches. And then we have our dissolve node, which is dissolving between those patches on the frames that we've specified. You can see our keyframes here. And then we're basically match moving our patch, which is just our stabilization, but in reverse. And then I'll talk about this later. And then basically that is our match move patch merging over the original plate, the original denoise plate. And when we go through the setup again, when we do it again from scratch, we're going to be adding some additional things to the setup. Cool, so let's just create a tracker node on the first frame. Just broaden out the tracking area a little bit, and we'll just track forward. And let's stabilize that. Yeah, so it doesn't feel perfect. It feels like there's a couple of jumps in there. That one's pretty noticeable. Maybe that's the worst one, so let's just fix that one. There we go, that feels a bit better from there, that point onwards. So now I'll just track forward from this new frame which we've adjusted. Cool, and now let's check that out. That feels a bit better there. So this is what I was talking about. We have it stabilized, but there's this big sort of change in perspective that we're not capturing, that we really need to capture. We're going to need to get it anyway for the match move, but like I said earlier, working with this area being properly stabilized is going to help us a lot. So let's try planar track this again. So we'll just go to the first frame and draw a shape around here. And let's track forward. So if we look at what the shape's doing, we can see it's doing mostly a good job until it kind of loses it at the end there. But we can refine that. If we click on the correct plane button up here, we can use this to establish a few points of reference on the suit that we can use to refine throughout the frame range. So if, say, we designate sort of these kind of points here as sort of the area that will define our plane, so we can drag those into place. And you can see it's kind of modifying the keyframes here as we drag these points. And then if we turn on these grid lines here, that'll give us a better indication of sort of how our plane is looking relative to the plate. So we're just going to be stepping through the range here and using our 4 points here to kind of set some new keyframes to correct our track where it's kind of going astray. And I should probably mention at this point that if you are following along to this tutorial in Nuke, you are going to be getting a different result to what I'm getting here, just because you're not placing your trackers exactly where I'm putting them, or drawing your shapes exactly where I'm placing them. And so the refinements that I'm making will likely be different to the refinements that you have to make on your end. And that's going to apply to quite a bit in this tutorial. So if you are following along in Nuke, I suggest that you just watch the methods of how I'm achieving the results, and then you can just pause the video or whatever, and then apply that to your own. You'll learn more that way anyway, I think, as opposed to those tutorials where you're just kind of aping exactly what the tutor is doing. And of course, if you do encounter an issue that I haven't encountered, feel free to drop a comment or message me. So we step through here. I think it's looking pretty good up to kind of this point, so we can set another keyframe here and say at this point it's fine. Maybe just move the points a little bit. So that's all looking good. And then actually there's a little bit of a jump there, but we can assess that later. And then stepping forward, set another keyframe. A little bit of guesswork in this, but it doesn't need to be completely perfect because we have our grid warp nodes, which I'll show you before. They're kind of like our fallback. This track is not going to be perfect, but we're going to get it kind of as good as possible without just going crazy and spending too much time on it. So it was looking good here, and then you can see that over those two frames it's really gone a bit crazy. So and then let's say we're happy with it on frame 20 here. Well, just set a key. And then adjust it on this final frame here. So let's just play that through, see what it looks like. Cool, I'm sure that's not perfect, but I think it's good enough for us to move on. Cool, and if we're happy with that, we go up here, and what we want is a stabilized corner pin. We'll just select the baked one. These options up here, that if you select one of these, that means it will be the corner pin node that you create will remain linked to the planar tracker. So as you update the track, the corner pin node itself will get updated with that new sort of tracking data. But let's just select our baked corner pin, hook that up to our tracker, and let's have a look at that. Cool, so yeah, it's definitely not perfect, but like I was saying, if we can get this 95% of the way there, then we can get the other 5% on the grid warp node. And, you know, there's plenty happening in the play. There's a lot of motion blur, there's lighting changes, so we're going to get away with a little bit. So I think we're happy with this, we're going to move on. So now that we have this stabilized, the next step is to find suitable frames for us to create our patches on. And this brings us to sort of the first common mistake that junior artists make, or that I see them make quite often, and that is picking the wrong frame to create a patch on. We always want to select the sharpest frame to create a patch on. Sometimes there are situations where the sharpest frame is unsuitable, that happens, but wherever possible the sharpest frame is the best. The reason for that is if we pick the frame that has the most detail, we should in theory be able to match it to all the other frames, at least in terms of sharpness and defocus. If for some reason we create a patch on the most defocused and motion blurred frame, so this frame for example, we're going to have a difficult or impossible time matching it to the other frames that are more in focus, such as this frame. It is very easy to add motion blur or defocus to a patch. It's very difficult to remove motion blur or make the patch less defocused. You know, it sucks when you spend ages painting up a frame only to realize that there was a much better frame to paint on, especially if it means you have to start over. So, spend a little bit of time going through the frame range and finding the very best frames to paint on, which is exactly what we did over here. Frame 2, frame 9, and frame 18. Those are our 3 sharpest frames. So let's get that going over here. Cool, so before we start painting away, let's discuss how we're actually going to do this in a way that we're going to get a really seamless result. So we need these patches to dissolve seamlessly together, which means that as they dissolve, they need to be really similar to each other. If you're dissolving between patches that are quite different, you're going to notice it straight away. You're going to see like a really soft area of the plate, and it's going to really catch the eye. Let's just try to demonstrate that with dissolve node. So these 2 frames here, not totally dissimilar, but different enough. And this is kind of what I'm talking about here. Like, this is the kind of thing you'll see if your patches aren't aligned well enough, and yeah, it's really going to catch the eye. That's why it's so important that these patches are just really lining up really accurately with each other when we dissolve between them. So how do we ensure that they're as similar as possible? What we don't want to do is we don't want to paint these 3 frames up separately from scratch. We have different perspectives on all 3 frames, so it's going to be really difficult to paint them up perfectly so that they are kind of seamlessly dissolving in between one another. Particularly between sort of this frame and this frame, it's going to be really difficult to sort of get these lines that you're painting up on this frame to match these lines, if you know what I mean. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to paint up one of the frames, we're going to track it in, warp it in, and then we're going to use that patch to inform the other patches. And what I mean by that is we're going to either reveal the paint that we've done on this patch, or we're going to use it as a kind of a reference of where we should be painting, so that we're not just kind of guessing. So let's start off by painting up this first frame here. So you can see over here, I'm actually using roto shapes as masks to limit where I paint, and I highly recommend you use this technique. So using roto shapes to kind of mask where your paint is going to be happening is really good for a few reasons. First of all, it means that you can kind of freely paint. You can paint a bit more loosely with the knowledge that your paint, is only going to go where this alpha is dictating. It makes painting straight lines a lot easier. Like painting these lines just freehand with a clone brush, it's going to be really tough. Another reason is if you have kind of a plate like this where you have a shape and then you sort of have this kind of dark and kind of shadow area around it, it means that you can use the same matte here that you're using to sort of block in this shape, and you can use that same matte, you can blur it, you can invert it, you can erode it outwards, to create these additional kind of effects or shadows or whatever you need really. And just the fact that you're using the same matte means that it's just going to give you a really consistent result. The other reason, and which is quite relevant to this kind of video, is it's going to give you a lot more control over how sharp your paint is. So we've deactivated all the blurs here, and you can see that this is a very sharp paintwork. Like, obviously it's got no detail in it, but that's going to get addressed later. But it gives you a very sharp, clean kind of result. And then you can blur it and to match the plate from that point. Alright, so let's start painting this frame up. So we'll start with our roto shape as discussed. Just make sure you're on the actual same frame as the frame hold. Just use a cusp Bezier. So the idea is we're just going to continue this shape up and just complete this kind of hexagonal shape. And this will probably actually be easier if we draw the circle in while we're doing this so that we can have that as kind of a reference as well. We're really only concerned with kind of what's happening up here, and I think that looks, yeah, that looks pretty good. And we can always adjust these shapes later. It's another good reason why this is a really good, useful kind of tool to use in painting. So there's more than one way to kind of go about painting this. I like to do it in layers, so working from the backwards forwards. So first I'd recreate this dark shadow, this border, then I'd paint in kind of this hexagonal thing, then I'd do the shadow that kind of surrounds the reactor here, and then finally I would do the reactor. You know, I think painting back to front makes the most sense, just logically, and you know, it makes the most sense from kind of a workflow perspective as well. So to create this shadow, I'm just going to create a paint node, P is the shortcut. Hook up the mask input to our Roto node, and then I'm just going to use the smear tool and set it to min. And if you don't know what the min blending mode does, it's basically going to select the minimum value. So as we kind of smear these values around, it's going to basically override the higher values with the lower values. And it will never do it the other way around. So for example, if I try to smear these values across, you can see that it's not letting me do that, because these values are higher value than these values. And if you wanted to do it the other way around, max will select the higher values. I highly recommend getting used to these two modes. Besides, you know, just the default over, min and max are by far the ones that I use the most. So let's just set that back, removal of our paint strokes, and now we're just going to smear those dark values up there. Now for this shadow, we kind of want it darker at the edge here, and then kind of we want like this falling off here that you see there. And in order to replicate that, this is where you kind of start getting creative with your blurs and your dilates and stuff. So erode. So let's erode it out a pixel. And then let's give it a bit of a blur. And one other node I really like is Expon Blur. So you can find this node on Nukepedia, and it's in the tutorial folders as well. If you increase the size, what you're going to get from it is it's going to give you this nice exponential blur that I find just gives kind of more of a natural kind of fall off, you know, as opposed to typical sort of boring linear fall off. Now that we have the shadow in, let's go ahead and paint in this lighter area here. And once again, we're going to use the smear tool, but this time we're going to use the max function. And then we can switch back to over and just kind of mix these values up a little bit. Quite a bit of a difference between the two sides, so you know, just know that when I'm painting this in, I'm not going for super accuracy here, but feel free to do a better job than I'm doing here. So we can see that this is much too sharp compared to the plate, so let's give it a blur. something like that. And you know, this is when, it's at this point we can kind of look at our shadow underneath and decide, you know, have we dilated that out far enough? Maybe we want to dilate that out more, maybe blur it a bit more. You know, we still have the ability to kind of go back and sort of adjust what we've done here. You know, this is why we're doing it this way, because it does give us the ability to easily modify without having to start again, or, you know, or erase a whole bunch of work that took us ages to do. So let's have a look at that. You know, and I think we can also be adjusting our shape maybe a little bit. Just bringing it down just a touch. And maybe also just increasing the fall off on that shadow a little bit maybe. Cool, so the next thing is adding in this kind of shadow area here. So let's draw a new shape for that. And we're going to need a custom shape for this one because the shadow beneath the reactor doesn't quite resemble our elliptical shape that we have. It has these kind of more sharp kind of corners to it, so we need our rotor to accurately represent that. And this is actually a little bit tricky doing this blind because we don't actually have a proper reference for where our reactor is. So I'm just going to copy our original elliptical shape that we've created up here, just so we can paint in something that can act as a visual reference, so we can create the rest of the shape here. And then if you select all the points, if you hold Control and then drag on these little handles here, you'll pull out the feathering points, which is what we want. So now that we have that matte doing roughly what the plate is doing in terms of fall off, let's hook up a paint node. And so we're going to be, once again, we're going to be smearing these darker values up. I don't love those red values there, so I'm just going to paint those out first. Just a bit worried about what they're going to do because they're quite dark values. So smear them all the way around. The other thing we can do is, if we're getting sort of this contrast in values here, we can always just blur them as well. So if you just turn that down a bit, and then we get something, it's a little bit of a more smooth result. And then let's get a bit of a blur on that, because we are getting this very sharp line here. Just a couple of pixel blur on that. And we're probably going to come back and adjust this shape once we see what it looks like when the reactor's painted on top. So let's go in now. We'll remove all of those paint strokes, and now we'll just paint up. So with this one I'm just going to keep it on over because, you know, we're not necessarily trying to only keep light values or only keep dark values. We kind of just want to smear these values up together. So let's start smearing. We'll change the max. And then let's change the min to get rid of these lighter values that are kind of breaking that look there. And don't forget, you also have your burn tool if you have any areas that need darkening down. I always just make sure that I turn the opacity right down and also turn off build-up here. It's definitely a tool that you need to use more gently and just kind of layer it up. Cool, so like I said, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time kind of painting this, having you guys watch me paint. I think, it's more the basic kind of principles that matter, and then you can yourself spend more time kind of refining this. But this definitely needs a couple of pixels of blur on it. And then I think this is when we can go back and refine this shape here that we did. Kind of to more replicate this kind of angular kind of thing that's happening here. By the way, if you want to add a point in the middle of a shape that's already been closed, if you hold Control Alt and click, that'll create a new point. Cool, so let's pretend that we are happy with that. Definitely not perfect. I think already you can see we're kind of changing the plate a little bit there, which doesn't, thrill me, but I would normally try to be a little bit more careful there, but I think that's fine. So let's duplicate our frame hold and then just put it at the bottom. That means that all of our paint strokes and stuff that are done on frame 2, they're not just going to turn off when it's not on frame 2. We want them lasting the whole frame range. Cool, so that's it. I mean, we have our first frame painted up. Now we need to create a roto shape so we can create our patch.